This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 447th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. It's been a month since I moved, and a month since I wrote a post, recorded a podcast, or edited a word of fiction. I tried to get ahead of myself as much as possible before moving, which turned out to be a good thing, since it took a whole month before I was able to get internet installed in my new house. Note to self, next time you move, check on the internet first thing. And the result was that I did hardly anything work or writing related for almost a month, other than check email once a day. It ended up being kind of a nice break, one that allowed me to get fully settled before diving back into the normal routine. Now that I'm back in it though, I'm thoroughly enjoying it. It feels like home now. And now I hope you enjoy today's topic, 5 lessons from a lost novel. Mistakes are unavoidable. To fear them is to fear life itself, and to try to eliminate them is to waste life in a futile struggle against reality itself. I dare say no one has more opportunities to learn these truths than does a writer. As writers, our lives are a never-ending litany of mistakes. Certainly mine has been full of mistakes. Everything from the opening sentences I wrote for this podcast, thought better of, and replaced, to literally hundreds of thousands of deleted words I've carefully saved from all my rough drafts, to entire story ideas, representing hundreds of hours of dedicated, hopeful work that have proven themselves unsalvageable and earned a dusty place in a back corner of a closet shelf. I won't say I don't regret these mistakes. I do. I regret the wasted time and effort. I regret the bereavement of loving and nurturing something that never came to fruition. I regret my own lack of foresight, wisdom, and understanding in failing to see pitfalls before I walked into them. If I'm being really honest, I'll have to admit that given the chance, I'd probably take back every single one of those mistakes. Fortunately, however, that is one mistake that the very design of life will prevent any one of us from ever making. I can't take back my mistaken words, ideas, and stories, and in being robbed of the chance to exercise my own foolish desire to do so, I am instead given the priceless gift of being able to learn from those retained mistakes. Learning from mistakes is unavoidably natural. Even when we're not consciously aware of the lessons we've absorbed from false starts, we have absorbed them. Whatever the mistakes we make in the future, they won't be the same ones we've made in the past, whether or not we avoid them purposefully. However, sometimes we will be able to consciously review mistakes at a later date. When this happens, we are essentially getting the chance to go back in time, revisit the cause and effect of earlier mistakes, and intentionally learn from them. Again, I dare say no one has more opportunities to do this than does a writer, since our mistakes are recorded forever in black and white. A few months ago, when recording the podcast on the advanced principles of show versus tell, I was feeling too lazy to write up brand new examples of showing, so I mined an old failed story. In so doing, I was drawn back to reread the whole thing. This book, titled The Deepest Breath, was a story of vengeance and forgiveness set in post-World War I Kenya. Since the start of my career as a published author, it is the only novel I have finished and then abandoned. Rereading this book, after having grown and changed significantly as both a writer and a person, was an eye-opening experience. The reason I gave up on the book back then was that I could sense its problems, but couldn't quantify them in a way that would allow me to fix them. Now, 5 years after abandoning it, I can see both what was wrong and what was right about the book. The mistakes I made then were made because I had not yet learned what I needed to know in order to avoid them. They were honest, earnest mistakes, born of the struggle to understand. Ultimately, they were mistakes that, however painful in their seeming fruitlessness at the time, were the very mistakes that taught me what I needed to do to see now clearly. Some of these mistakes were unique to the story itself, but some are, I feel, universal mistakes that many struggling novelists make and instinctively recoil from without yet knowing what exactly the problem is or how to fix it. So today I would like to look at 5 of the mistakes I made that ultimately contributed to The Deepest Breath becoming one of my lost novels. Also, how I could have avoided those mistakes had I known then what I know now, and how you can learn from my mistakes. Now, looking back, I'd almost argue that The Deepest Breath was the one novel out of all my novels that I worked hardest on. I outlined and researched the heck out of it. It went through many iterations. In fact, all intents and purposes, I wrote it as 3 separate and distinct novels along the way. Originally, I intended it as a dual timeline story, with the 3 main characters' present-day story in 1925 Kenya juxtaposed against their dark backstory during World War I. I initially decided to write the entirety of the war section first, with the intent of then interweaving it throughout the quote-unquote main story. This is an approach I would now adamantly reject due to its inherent problems with organic flow between timelines. So after realizing that wasn't working, which was based mostly on the epiphany that the backstory had some major causal issues, I decided to scrap the idea of dramatizing the backstory and instead just focus on the main story, about the fallout in the relationships among 2 men who had met in World War I and the woman they realized they both loved. I wrote 1 iteration in the present tense, realized it was a mess, and rewrote it extensively into another draft in past tense. Now, along the way, the book improved dramatically, but despite all my years of work, I eventually realized it was still broken and I had no idea how to fix it. Now, looking back, I can see that it actually ended up being a pretty good story. There's a ton I like about it. In some ways, I think it's the best character piece I've ever written. The setting in Kenya is one of my best realized settings ever. The plot is quietly foreboding, the pacing moving slowly, and yet with the power of a train hurtling toward an inevitable conclusion. And yet, it didn't work because at the time I wrote it, I didn't understand enough about the fundamental principles of story to be able to ask myself the 5 following questions. Question number 1. Who was the protagonist? The one unavoidably massive issue with this book was its pervasive lack of focus. Ultimately, it's a story of a complicated love triangle. Each of the 3 main characters were equally important, and I chose to equally balance the story amongst their 3 POVs. Nothing inherently wrong with that. But at the time I wrote it, I didn't yet fully understand how story structure guides and creates a story's focus. This showed up in several areas of this story, but most obviously in the fact that I clearly didn't understand who this book's protagonist was. And if I, as the author, didn't know, then how are readers supposed to know? But couldn't all 3 main characters be the protagonist? That's actually a question I'm asked frequently by writers in regard to their own stories. What I understand now, and didn't back then, was that the answer is an unequivocal no. A story's structural unity is bound up in the relationship of important plot points to the protagonist. However prominent other characters may be, the protagonist is the one who ultimately defines the story. How? By providing a strong, consistent through line. The structural beats tell us what a story is about. If the first plot point is about one character, the midpoint about another character, and the third plot point about still another, then this is a story that doesn't know what it's about. So, in a story in which multiple characters are prominently important to the story, how do you decide which is the protagonist? The best way of identifying your story's through-line character or protagonist is by examining the climactic moment. Which character is the agent of action in the climactic moment? Which character definitively ends and or comments upon the plot's primary conflict? This character is the character who defines the story. This is the protagonist. This is the story's linchpin. And that must be reflected at every major structural point throughout the story. Otherwise, your story will fall into the same category as mine, a beautiful mess. Question number 2. What is the essence of this story. Too often, when a story structure is left undefined by a strong central character, the result is a correspondingly wobbly theme. In my case, The Deepest Breath was actually a deeply thematic novel. What interested me most about it was its theme of undeserved forgiveness. The title itself was a quote from the story's climactic line when one character finally acted out that forgiveness on behalf of another. So you'd think the theme would have been the one thing I got right. Not so much. At the time of writing that book, I was neck deep in learning how to grapple with the principles of structure. I hadn't even yet begun to understand how to consciously actuate theme by purposefully creating actionable cohesion between plot and theme at every structural moment. The result was a well-intentioned story that, although it may have had some great thematic moments and ideas, didn't actually execute its theme on every page. Actually, it's kind of hard to tell what the story was really about. Was it about forgiveness? Was it about PTSD and fear? Was it about trust in relationships? Was it about striving against the confines of social class? Was it about love? Was it about friendship? Was it about justice versus mercy? If I'd possessed a better understanding of how to create a cohesive thematic truth against which to measure every aspect of my character's struggles, I could very well have written a story that unified all these ideas by pointing them toward the same end goal. Instead, I ended up with a story full of half-baked notions that seemed to be pointing in a dozen directions at once. Were I writing this story again today, I would start by forming my thematic idea about forgiveness into a definitive lie and truth for all three of my main characters. With so many prominent characters, I would have had the opportunity to explore multiple facets of my topic, but in a way that tied all their journeys into the tapestry of a larger picture. This, in turn, would have given me a guideline against which to choose which subplots supported this thematic idea and its ultimate realization in the climactic moment, and which distracted from the unified premise I was trying to create. Question number 3. Is the backstory pertinent? Something I've noticed as I've grown up as a novelist is that when a writer doesn't fully understand her story, or story in general, backstory has a way of trying to take over. In the days before I understood how the structure of plot, character, and theme worked, I often spent an unwanted amount of time amassing huge backstories designed to help me try to understand what the main story, and the character's motivations within it, was really about. Nothing inherently wrong with huge backstories. Indeed, they're the deep wells from which complex novels draw their subtext. But backstory, like the main story, must always be focused and pertinent. As I said before, I originally intended The Deepest Breath to present dual timelines that alternated between the characters' past and present. Looking back, I realized this idea was mostly a crutch designed to help me flesh out character motivations I didn't yet fully understand. The reason I eventually rejected this approach and axed the novel-length backstory section I'd already written was that the backstory was a crazy mess of boring trench scenes and unrealistic spy thriller stuff that had very little to do with the main story. Backstory is always important. Even when it is not shared outright with readers, it will always influence the author's understanding of the characters and their story. Therefore, it must be pertinent. It can't be a fun, rambling romp through ancillary adventures. It must be the staging ground for the character's journey through the main story. From a structural vantage point, the backstory's single most important job is that of setting up the character's motivation for investing in the lie/truth that will be explored in the main part of the story. I did understand this when I wrote Deepest. In fact, the whole point of the backstory was to create the ghosts that would drive my characters in the main part of their story 10 years later. Unfortunately, I got distracted and created a whole rambling mess of a backstory that detracted from the main story's focus far more than it contributed. Had I this book to do over again, I would vastly simplify the backstory, focusing it less on all the stuff I'd researched about World War I and more on the needs of the main story's plot and theme. Question number 4. Are you clinging to ugly darlings? We write stories because at some point we fell in love with some beautiful kernel of inspiration. It's only natural we wouldn't want to relinquish that special kernel. And yet, sometimes as a story evolves, it evolves past its early inspirations. Deepest got its start as a dream. The only story I've ever written based on a dream. I woke up one morning with a vivid memory of a man dressed in early 20th century clothes escaping with his injured wife on a passenger liner. I loved that scene. I still love it. It's incredibly evocative to me on both a sensory and an emotional level. But I tried way too hard to keep that scene exactly as I dreamed it in the story. Perhaps the hardest part of being a writer is realizing that just because an idea is wonderful doesn't mean it deserves to be written. The mark of all great stories is their cohesion and focus. Any element, no matter how organically beautiful, that detracts from the larger picture is an element that must be eliminated. This principle gets harder and harder to enforce the more time and effort we spend on an idea. Axing an imagined idea is one thing. Axing an idea you've spent perhaps years writing and rewriting and tweaking and fixing is 1,000 times more difficult. Not least because familiarity and propinquity cause us to lose perspective. When I wrote this book, I had a hard time cutting elements that at the time felt like the whole point. Today, from a more distant perspective, I could dispassionately identify, chop, and rearrange for the story's greater benefit. Question number 5. Do you truly understand the story you're trying to tell? Stories are strange beasts. Sometimes the story we think we're telling isn't the story at all. Other times, we may understand what we're trying to do, but get hung up on habitual techniques and approaches that don't serve the art as well as they might. 5 years later, I recognize The Deepest Breath is an entirely different type of story from anything else I've ever written. It's more character-focused, less plot-driven, it's darker, it's quieter, it's more realistic, more literary. I knew all of that on some level when I wrote it, and yet I still tried to shoehorn it into my own familiar tropes of the heroic action-adventure genre. The story's climax, in particular, suffers from my mistaken attempt to take a hitherto subdued character story and funnel it into a shoot-'em-up finale. It often takes time and experience to recognize, but an author's 2 greatest commandments are, number 1, know your story, number 2, trust your story. Looking back, I didn't trust my story, or myself, enough to let it be what it wanted to be. I feared its quietness, feeling it was too slow or too boring. However, in rereading it, I was surprised to realize how strong and compelling the tension is throughout the book. Had I just trusted that in the beginning, I might have written a much better third act. Again, this principle returns to the idea of cohesion. The point of any piece of art is the creation of an effect. We wish to have an effect on our readers, to leave them with a specific feeling or thought. To do this, we must consciously craft that effect at every stage of the story, bringing plot, character, theme, tone, setting, and pacing together into a unified whole, with each piece trusting the other to support it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Now that I think I'm all old and wise and have figured out all of my book's problems, I should go back and rewrite it, right? Maybe. Honestly, I'm just happy to have returned to what has been a somewhat painful memory and discover that, after all, I had not betrayed or been betrayed by this dear friend from whom I had parted on less than genial terms. The Deepest Breath is not, by far, the worst thing I've ever written. But perhaps for that very reason, I do think of it as my greatest mistake. I doubt I will ever return to fix it. There are just too many new stories to write. Happily, however, every one of those new stories will benefit from the many, many mistakes I made when writing that particular novel. So maybe it wasn't a mistake after all. So I'd love to hear what you think. Do you have any lost stories? And what is the biggest lesson you've learned from them and from your mistakes? If you'd like to be part of the Word Player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on iTunes. And if you'd like to support Helping Writers Become Authors, I would totally appreciate it if you'd consider taking the time to leave a quick rating or review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.